The air inside the bistro was heavy, filled with a mix of expensive perfume, the sharp smell of roasted garlic, and the low hum of quiet conversations. It was the kind of place where people went to be seen, to make deals, or to show off how much money they had. The lights were dimmed just enough to make the gold trim on the walls sparkle, and every table was covered in crisp white cloths that felt like ironed snow. In the center of all this sat a grand piano. It was a beautiful, shiny black beast of an instrument, but for the last few months it had been silent. It was mostly used now to hold a large vase of white lilies, looking more like a piece of furniture than something meant to make music. Alina moved through the room like a ghost. She was 25, though the tiredness in her eyes made her look a little older. Her uniform was a simple black dress with a white apron tied around her waist. It was clean, but it had been washed so many times that the fabric was starting to thin at the edges. She carried a heavy silver tray loaded with dirty plates and half-filled glasses. Her feet hurt inside her flat, worn-out shoes. She had been on her feet for 6 hours straight, and the ache in her lower back was a constant reminder of the long shift she still had ahead of her. She wasn't just a waitress here. She was part of the furniture, just like the piano or the paintings on the wall. The customers didn't really look at her. They looked through her. She was the person who filled the water glass when it was empty and took the plate away when they were done. They mumbled thanks without looking up from their phones or their companions. She was used to it. It was a survival mechanism. If she didn't expect them to see her, it didn't hurt when they didn't. At a table near the window, a wealthy philanthropist named Arthur sat alone. He was an older man with silver hair and a face that showed a lifetime of making hard decisions. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Alina made in 3 months. He was waiting for a business associate who was late, so he sat sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the room. He wasn't looking at the other patrons. He was looking at the staff. He was a man who noticed details. He watched the busboys rushing to clear tables. And he watched Alina. Arthur saw something in Alina that the other people missed. He saw the way she carried herself. It wasn't the defeated posture of someone just trying to get through the day. There was a tension in her shoulders, a rhythm in her step that looked like she was holding on to something. He had been watching her for the last 20 minutes. Every time she passed the piano, her pace slowed down just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, something only a trained observer would catch. Alina approached the table closest to the piano to pick up a check. The family sitting there had just left, leaving a mess of napkins and crumbs. As she leaned over to gather the plates, her hand moved across the empty space where the piano lid should have been open. Her fingers, rough and red from working in hot water all day, brushed against the cold, black wood. She stopped for a split second. She didn't tap the keys. She didn't make a sound. She just let her hand rest there. In that brief moment, her face changed. The mask of the tired waitress fell away. Her eyes softened and her lips parted slightly. She didn't look like a waitress clearing a table. She looked like a musician remembering a melody she used to love. Her fingers curled slightly, pressing onto the wood as if she were silently playing a chord. A ghost of a song that only she could hear. It was a look of pure, aching longing. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before she snapped her hand back, grabbed the dirty plates, and rushed away toward the kitchen, the mask slipping back into place. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee and set the cup down on the saucer with a soft clink. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew that look. He had seen it plenty of times in boardrooms and at charity events, usually on the faces of people who had given up on their true passions to chase money or security. But seeing it on a young waitress in a crowded bistro hit him differently. He looked at the piano, covered in flowers, and then at the swinging kitchen door through which Alina had disappeared. It seemed like a tragedy to him. Here was this beautiful instrument gathering dust, and here was a woman who clearly had music in her soul, wasting her talent carrying plates for people who didn't even know her name. He felt a sudden, strong urge to do something about it. He wasn't usually the type to meddle in the lives of strangers. But tonight, the silence of the piano felt louder than the noise of the crowd. The restaurant buzzed on around him. A waiter dropped a fork with a loud crash, causing a few heads to turn, but Arthur didn't flinch. He kept staring at the kitchen door. He wondered how long it had been since she actually played. He wondered why she stopped. Life had a way of pushing people off their paths. He knew that. Bills pile up, families need help, and suddenly, the thing you love the most becomes a luxury you can't afford. Alina emerged from the kitchen a few minutes later, looking flushed and hurried. She had a new order to deliver. She walked quickly, her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to be as invisible as possible. She didn't look at the piano this time. She forced herself to look straight ahead, scared that if she looked at it again, the pain of missing it would be too much to handle while she was working. Arthur watched her dodge, a waiter carrying a tray of champagne. She was good at her job, efficient and quick, but there was a heaviness to her movements now. The moment of lightness by the piano was gone, replaced by the reality of the floor. She stopped at a table across the room to take an order, pulling a small notepad out of her apron. She smiled politely at the customers, but it didn't reach her eyes. Arthur signaled for the waiter. He didn't want another coffee. He wanted to change the script of the evening. He had a feeling that the music in the room wasn't dead. It was just trapped. And he had the keys to let it out, or at least he had the nerve to try. The contrast between the lively, wealthy crowd and the silent, dusty piano gnawed at him. It felt wrong. He decided he wasn't going to sit there and ignore it. He was going to take a gamble. He looked at his watch and then back toward Alina, who was now refilling water glasses at the far end of the room. The night was about to take a very different turn. Alina walked back onto the floor, feeling the cool air of the dining room hit her flushed face. The kitchen was hot and chaotic, a swirl of shouting cooks and clanging pans, so the dining room felt calm by comparison. But it was a heavy kind of calm. She adjusted the strap of her apron, pulling it tight against her lower back to ease the ache that had settled there hours ago. She looked down at her order pad, making sure she had everything right for table 4. Just another table, just another tip. Just another night of being invisible. She moved through the maze of tables, dodging a waiter who was balancing a tray full of dirty wine glasses. She was good at weaving through crowds without touching anyone, a skill she had perfected over years of working in busy restaurants. It was like she occupied a slightly different space than everyone else. The customers were there to enjoy themselves. She was there to make sure they could. She was the machinery in the background, as she rounded the corner near the center of the room. She saw the man at table 9 wave his hand. It was the older gentleman in the expensive suit, the one who had been sitting alone for a long time. He wasn't waving frantically like he was in a hurry. It was a slow, deliberate wave. Alina felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. Usually, when a customer signaled her like that, it meant something was wrong. The soup was cold. The bread was stale. The water wasn't sparkling enough. She took a deep breath, put on her polite customer service smile, and walked over to him. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice soft and steady. "Is everything all right with your coffee? Can I get you something else?" She stood by his table, holding her hands behind her back. She waited for the complaint. She was ready to apologize, to offer to fix it, to run back to the kitchen and fix the mistake. It was part of the routine. But the man didn't complain. He didn't even look at his coffee. He was looking right at her. His eyes were sharp and observant, studying her face in a way that made her feel exposed. Most people didn't look waitresses in the eye. They looked at the name tag or the menu, but this man looked at her. He had a cane resting against the side of his chair, polished wood with a silver handle. He reached out and picked it up, then pointed the silver tip toward the grand piano standing just a few feet away from his table. "You play?" he asked. It wasn't a trick question. It wasn't sarcastic. His voice was deep and a little rough, like gravel, but it was serious. Alina blinked, completely caught off guard. She felt her face get hot. For a second, she couldn't find her voice. She glanced at the piano, then quickly back at him. I'm sorry, sir." "The piano," he said, tapping the cane gently against the floor. "I saw you earlier. You touched the lid. Your fingers. They know the keys. Do you play?" Alina felt a sudden rush of panic. She looked around to see if anyone was watching. The other tables were busy with their own conversations. The restaurant manager was behind the bar, counting cash. No one was paying attention. She looked back at the old man and felt a strange urge to run away. Not anymore, she said quickly. She tightened her grip on her order pad. Just old habits. The man raised an eyebrow. He leaned back in his chair, looking more interested. Old habits don't die that easily, Alina. I can tell. He knew her name. Of course, he could read the plastic tag pinned to her chest, but hearing him say it made it feel more real. Really, sir? She said, trying to laugh it off, but the laugh sounded fake and hollow. I haven't touched a keyboard in years. My hands. They aren't what they used to be. They're for carrying trays now. She looked down at her hands. They were rough, the nails cut short, the skin dry from washing them 100 times a day. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. They looked like workers' hands. The man didn't look at her hands with judgment. He looked at them with respect. I have a good eye for these things, he said. And I have a feeling your hands remember more than you think. The body doesn't forget. The music is still in there. Lena stood frozen. She wanted to tell him to stop. She wanted to tell him that she had student loans she couldn't pay, that her car had broken down twice this month, that her dream of being a musician had died when she realized she had to eat. But she couldn't say any of that. She just stood there, feeling a lump form in her throat. My waiter is incompetent, the man said suddenly, changing the subject. Alina looked over at the bar. A young bartender was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone and laughing at a video. He wasn't paying attention to the floor at all. Look at him, the man said, shaking his head. I've been waiting for 10 minutes for a refill. The service is terrible tonight. Alina stepped forward instinctively, ready to defend her coworker or to get the refill herself. I can get that for you right away, sir. I'm so sorry. No, the man interrupted, holding up a hand to stop her. I don't want the coffee. I want the music. You. He pointed again at the piano bench. Play for me. Just one song. Consider it a favor to an old man who can't stand the silence. Consider it. Part of the service. Lena shook her head frantically. The idea terrified her. I can't, sir. Please. I really can't. It's been years. I'm rusty. If I play, I'll mess up. I'll embarrass myself, and I can't afford to lose this job. You won't lose the job, the man said firmly. There was a tone in his voice that was hard to argue with. It wasn't mean, but it was powerful. It was the voice of someone who was used to being listened to. He looked at the manager behind the bar, then back at her. Besides, he lowered his voice, just for her to hear. Everyone out here is bored with their own conversations. They need something real. You need something real. I don't have any music, Alina whispered, looking around the room again. Her heart was beating hard against her ribs. You don't need sheet music, he said. You have the song in your head. I saw it on your face. Play what you were playing when you touched the piano earlier. He paused, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. Please, Elena, sit down. Play. It wasn't really a request. It was a push. A gentle but firm push. He was challenging her. He was telling her that he saw her. He was telling her that she wasn't just a ghost carrying plates. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded away. The clinking forks, the low laughter, the music from the speakers, it all turned into a blur. All she could hear was the silence of the grand piano sitting next to her. She looked at the black bench. It was polished and smooth. She looked at the keys, partially hidden by the vase of lilies. She remembered how it felt to sit there, the weight of the keys under her fingers, the vibration of the soundboard against her back. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like a different person. Alina took a shaky breath. She looked at the old man. He wasn't smiling. He was waiting. He believed she could do it, and for some reason, that terrified her more than if he had been making fun of her. Okay, she whispered, so quietly she could barely hear herself. One song. Good, the man said. He nodded once, a satisfied look on his face. Alina slowly set down her tray on a nearby empty table. She took off her apron and folded it, laying it next to the tray. Her hands were trembling as she walked the few steps to the piano. It felt like the longest walk of her life. She could feel the eyes of the old man burning into her back, willing her forward. She reached out and moved the heavy vase of flowers off the piano lid. Setting it gently on the floor, she sat down on the bench. It was hard and cold. She smoothed her skirt down over her legs, feeling out of place. She was a waitress in a cheap dress, sitting at $1,000 instrument. She felt like a fraud. But as she placed her fingers on the cold ivory keys, a strange thing happened. Her fingers stopped trembling. They settled into a C major chord, like they were greeting an old friend. She looked out at the room. People were eating, talking, laughing. They didn't know what was about to happen. She was just the waitress. But she knew. And the man in the suit knew. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes to shut out the world, and pressed down. The very first sound that came out of the instrument was a surprise. It wasn't beautiful. The C major chord she struck wobbled and drifted out of tune, the high notes sounding slightly sharp against the rumbling bass. It was an ugly, imperfect sound. Alina flinched, her shoulders hunching up around her ears. She waited for someone to laugh. She waited for a glass to shatter or a voice to call out and tell her to stop making noise. But the restaurant didn't erupt in laughter. Instead, a heavy silence seemed to spread outward from the piano. Cutting through the ambient noise of the room, Alina kept her eyes squeezed shut. If she looked at the people, she knew she would freeze up. She would remember that she was a waitress in a worn-out dress, sitting where she didn't belong. So, she focused entirely on the feeling of her hands. Her fingers, usually stiff and curled around trays and heavy plates, felt strange against the smooth, cool ivory. They were rough, her skin dry and calloused, but the tips remembered the shape of the keys. It was a muscle memory that went deeper than her brain, a ghost of a life she used to have. She took a deep, shaky breath and let her left hand find a rhythm. It started slow, a simple heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't a classical piece she had learned in a book. It wasn't a sonata or a concerto. It was something she had hummed to herself on the bus rides home, a melody she had tapped out on the steering wheel of her car while stuck in traffic. It was raw and unpolished, made up of bits and pieces of songs she had heard and songs she wished she could write. At first the notes were hesitant. She played a phrase, then stopped, as if checking to see if she was allowed to continue. But the silence in the room gave her permission. It was a waiting silence, not an angry one. The man in the suit was watching her. She could feel his gaze on her like a spotlight, but it didn't feel hot or demanding. It felt steady. Emboldened by the quiet, her right hand began to move. It started with a slow, mournful trickle of notes, like rain falling on a window pane. Then, as her confidence grew, the melody began to climb. It weaved through the higher registers, ringing out clear and loud despite the slightly out-of-tune strings. She wasn't thinking about chords or scales or music theory anymore. She was just playing. As the music grew, so did the feeling inside her chest. For the last few years, Alina had been holding everything in. She held in the stress of rent, the frustration of rude customers, the loneliness of coming home to an empty apartment, and the deep, hollow ache of giving up on her dream. She had pushed all those feelings down, burying them under a polite smile and a "yes, sir," right away. But music has a way of digging things up. Her fingers began to press harder into the keys. The rhythm quickened. The soft, hesitant rain turned into a storm. The melody shifted from sad to angry, crashing down in heavy, dissonant chords that made the piano vibrate against her back. She wasn't just playing a song. She was arguing with the universe. She was playing about the unfairness of it all. She played about the nights she spent studying until 3 a.m., only to realize she couldn't afford the next semester. She played about her father's old radio, and the way her mother used to smile when she heard her practice. Tears began to leak from the corners of her eyes, sliding hot down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She couldn't. Her hands were too busy. They were moving faster now, flying up and down the keyboard with a power she didn't know she still had. Her body swayed back and forth, the tiredness in her back forgotten, replaced by an electric energy. She was pouring her soul into the instrument, transferring the heavy weight she carried into the strings and hammers, letting the sound carry it away. The patrons of the restaurant, usually so wrapped up in their own little worlds, began to notice. It wasn't a sudden change. It was a ripple, A man at a nearby table stopped talking mid-sentence, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. He turned his head toward the piano, a confused look on his face. The music wasn't background noise anymore. You couldn't ignore it. It was too intense, too raw. A young couple near the window put their phones down. They stopped scrolling through social media and just listened. The woman tilted her head, her eyes softening as she heard the desperation in the melody. It wasn't the smooth, polished jazz they usually played in the bistro. It was human. It sounded like real life, messy and painful. Even the staff paused. The bartender, who had been checking his phone, looked up with his mouth slightly open. He watched Alina, realizing he had never actually seen her before. Not really. He had just seen the uniform. Now he saw a woman pouring her heart out. The manager stepped out from behind the register, his arms crossed over his chest, frowning slightly. He was worried about the disruption, but the frown softened as he listened. He realized the customers weren't complaining. They were mesmerized. The music swelled to a crescendo. Elena's hands were a blur. The bass notes thundered, shaking the floorboards, while the high notes sang out like a cry for help. It was chaotic and beautiful, full of jagged edges and sudden soft whispers. She hit a wrong note, a sharp, jarring sound that would have made her quit a week ago. But tonight, she didn't stop. She just kept playing, weaving the mistake into the song, making it part of the story. It felt like she was running, sprinting toward something she had lost a long time ago. She was breathless. Her chest heaved with the effort, but she didn't want to stop. She felt more alive in this moment than she had in years. The barrier between her and the world was gone. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was loud. She was present. She was taking up space, and the world was stopping to listen. The man in the suit sat perfectly still. He had seen many musicians in his life, professionals who played with perfect technique and no soul. This was different. This was messy, but it was real. He watched the tears on her face and the way her fingers attacked the keys, and he knew he had been right. The talent was there. It had just been buried under layers of exhaustion and hardship. Slowly, the music began to change. The anger and the desperation started to fade, replaced by a gentler, more accepting tone. The storm was passing. The melody became simpler, slower. It was like the sun coming out after the rain. Her hands slowed down, the heavy chords turning into soft, delicate octaves. She was playing a lullaby now, perhaps for herself. A way of saying that it was okay to rest, even if just for a moment. She played one final phrase, a series of descending notes that drifted down to the bottom of the keyboard. Her left hand played a low, deep note, and her right hand hovered over the keys, playing a soft, whispering chord that faded into nothing. She held the sustain pedal down, letting the vibration hang in the air. Echoing off the high ceiling then, silence. Alina sat there, her hands resting on the keys, her chest heaving. She kept her eyes closed for a second longer, terrified to open them. She didn't know what she would find. She didn't know if they would clap or if they would just go back to their soup and ignore her, leaving her feeling foolish and exposed. She sat in the echo of the last note, her heart beating harder than it had when she started. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick, waiting to be broken. For 10 long seconds, the restaurant remained frozen in that heavy, vibrating silence. The final notes of Elena's performance had faded into the air, but the feeling they left behind hung like smoke in a room without windows. Alina sat on the bench, her hands still resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was terrified to open her eyes. In her mind, she was already back in the uniform, rushing to clear a table. Hearing the clatter of plates and the indifference of the crowd, she thought she had just made a fool of herself in front of a room full of strangers. She expected to hear a cough, a laugh, or the rude clatter of someone dropping a fork to break the awkwardness. But then a sound cut through the silence. It wasn't a laugh. It was the scrape of a chair legs against the hardwood floor. Elena's eyes flew open. She blinked rapidly, the tears on her lashes making her vision blurry. As her eyes focused, she saw him. The older man in the expensive suit, Arthur. He was standing up. He didn't stand up quickly or casually. He pushed himself up with a deliberate effort, using his cane for support, and turned his entire body to face her. He wasn't looking at his watch. He wasn't looking for his late associate. He was looking only at her. He brought his hands together. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a slow, rhythmic, thunderous applause. Clap, clap, clap. The sound was sharp and commanding. The reaction rippled through the room, like a wave hitting the shore. The man at the table near the window stopped chewing and stood up. The young couple who had put their phones away stood up. One by one, people pushed their chairs back and rose to their feet. Within moments, the entire dining room was standing. The applause grew from a rhythm to a roar. It wasn't just noise. It was an overwhelming wall of sound that washed over Alina. Her face flushed a deep, hot red. She felt exposed, stripped of her invisibility. She wasn't used to this. She was used to being the person in the background, the one who made sure other people had a good time. She had never been the reason for the applause. She instinctively moved to stand up and hide behind the piano, but her legs felt like jelly. She gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. She looked out at the sea of faces. They weren't looking through her anymore. They were looking at her. And for the first time, she didn't see judgment in their eyes. She saw surprise, awe, and something that looked like respect. The businessman who had been complaining about the stock market earlier was now smiling at her, actually smiling. The woman in the diamond necklace had her hand pressed over her heart, tears glistening in her own eyes. They had stopped being customers for a few minutes and become human beings. Connected by the music, Alina didn't know what to do. A nervous laugh bubbled up in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She slowly stood up, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. She felt small standing there in her cheap uniform in front of all these wealthy, powerful people, but the music had given her a kind of armor. She bowed her head slightly, a clumsy, awkward curtsy that wasn't practiced or formal. It was just a gesture of thanks. The applause got even louder when she stood up. Someone whistled from the back of the room. It was a sharp, cheerful sound that broke the tension. Alina felt a tear spill over her cheek, hot and fast. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, smudging a little bit of mascara, but she didn't care. She looked over at Arthur. He was still standing, still clapping. He caught her eye and gave her a small, dignified nod. It was a look that said, "I told you so," but it was kind. It was the nod of a teacher to a student who has just passed the hardest exam of their life. He didn't shout or cheer. He just stood there, grounding the moment, making sure she knew that this was real. The restaurant manager, a man who usually stressed out over the smallest things, walked out from behind the bar. He looked around the room at the standing ovation and then at Alina. He didn't scold her for stopping work. He didn't tell her to get back to her tables. He just shook his head slowly, a look of disbelief on his face. He had probably heard 1,000 pianists in that restaurant, but he had never heard a sound like that. The applause began to die down after a while, settling into a softer, appreciative rhythm. People started to sit back down, but the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The cold, snobbish vibe was gone. It felt warmer. People were leaning across tables to talk to each other, but they weren't talking about business or gossip. They were talking about the music. They were talking about her. Alina felt dizzy. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving her feeling shaky and weak. She looked at the empty bench and then at the kitchen door. Part of her wanted to run. She wanted to run back to the safety of the kitchen, where her hands were rough and useful, and nobody expected her to be a genius. The reality of what she had just done was crashing down on her. She had let everything out. She had shown them her scars. She took a step away from the piano, intending to just grab her apron and disappear. But Arthur began to make his way toward her. He moved slowly, using his cane, but the crowd parted for him like water. He walked right up to the edge of the piano platform. Alina froze. She felt like a little kid again, waiting to be scolded by the principal. She clasped her hands together in front of her, squeezing her fingers tight. "You have a gift, Alina," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the quiet room, it carried perfectly. It was rough, but warm. It is a rare and dangerous thing to play like that. Dangerous because it makes people feel things they don't want to feel. I didn't mean to cause a scene, sir, Elena stammered, her voice cracking. She looked down at her shoes. I should get back to work. Table 4 is waiting for their check. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket. Elena held her breath. She was sure he was pulling out a wad of cash. A big tip. That's what happened in stories, right? The rich man hears the poor girl play, gives her $100, and goes back to his dinner. She didn't want money. It felt dirty. It felt like he was paying her to stop feeling, paying for the entertainment she had given them for free. Work can wait, Arthur said firmly. He pulled out his hand. But he wasn't holding a stack of bills. He was holding a simple, cream-colored business card. He held it out to her. This is not charity, Arthur said, reading her mind. Charity is for people who need help. You don't need help. You need a stage. Elena looked at the card, then up at his face. What is this? This, Arthur said, tapping the card gently, is a phone number and a name. The name is on the back. Lena took the card. It was heavy, high-quality paper with raised black lettering. On the front, it just had his name and a logo. She turned it over. In his strong, scrawling handwriting, there was a name she didn't recognize and a series of numbers underneath it. He is an old friend of mine, Arthur explained. He runs the city conservatory downtown. He is stubborn, difficult to work with, and he hates the modern world. But he knows more about piano than anyone else in this city. Lena stared at the card. The city conservatory. It was a legendary place, a school for the elite. She had walked past it once, years ago, just to look at the building, knowing she could never afford to walk inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. I can't go there, she whispered. I don't have the money, sir. I don't even have a piano, and I have bills. I have just endowed a new scholarship there, Arthur interrupted her. It is a very specific scholarship. It is for people who are too old to be prodigies, too poor to pay tuition, and too busy to dream. It covers everything. Lessons, practice time, books, even a living allowance, so you don't have to carry trays on tired feet. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto hers. The audition is next Tuesday at noon. Don't be late, and don't you dare let him tell you that you are too old to learn. You play with more soul than any of his 18-year-old students ever will. Lena looked at the numbers on the card. They blurred through her fresh tears. She looked up at the wealthy philanthropist, this stranger who had seen her when she was invisible. He hadn't just given her money. He had seen the person underneath the uniform. He had given her back her life. I don't know what to say, she choked out. Arthur smiled. A genuine crinkling of the eyes that made him look years younger. Don't say anything, just play. Go stun yourself, Elena, then go stun him. He turned slowly and began to walk back to his table. The room was still buzzing, the energy completely transformed. Elena stood alone by the piano, clutching the small piece of paper in her hand. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a long, gray tunnel of shifts and bills. It looked like a door, and she was holding the key. The heavy wooden doors of the conservatory were much taller than Elena had expected. They loomed over her, made of dark oak with brass handles that shone like gold. Standing in front of them, Elena felt very small. She clutched her bag tightly against her chest. Feeling the simple cardboard folder inside that held her sheet music pages. She had printed off the library computer and taped together because the ink was running low. She looked down at her clothes. She wasn't wearing a tuxedo or an elegant gown like the other students walking into the building. She was wearing her best outfit, a knee-length black skirt and a crisp white button-down shirt she had ironed 3 times that morning to get the wrinkles out. It was clean and it was neat. But next to the expensive coats and scarves of the music students walking past, she felt out of place. She felt like an intruder. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cold city air. She remembered the night in the restaurant. She remembered the sound of the applause and the look in Arthur's eyes when he told her she belonged here. She reached into her pocket and touched the business card he had given her. It was worn soft now from her rubbing it over the last few days, a talisman to give her courage. Don't be late, he had said. She checked her watch. She was 20 minutes early. Elena pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The atmosphere changed instantly. The noise of the street traffic, honking, chatter vanished, replaced by a smell of old wood, floor wax, and dust. It smelled like history. The hallway was wide and echoing, lined with portraits of severe-looking men and women from centuries past. They all seemed to be staring down at her, judging her. She walked softly, her flat shoes making no sound on the polished floor, trying not to be seen. She found the reception desk, where a stern woman with glasses looked up from a computer screen. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for an audition," Elena said. Her voice shook a little, and she hated herself for it. "For the scholarship?" "The new one." "My name is Elena." The woman's expression didn't change. She tapped a few keys. "Room 304, third floor. You can wait in the hall." "Thank you," Elena whispered. She turned and walked toward the stairs, her heart pounding harder with every step. This was it. The moment Arthur had pushed her toward. If this went wrong, she would just go back to the restaurant. She would go back to carrying trays. It was a safe thought, but it terrified her now because she knew she didn't want to be safe anymore. She wanted to be here. Room 304 was at the end of a long, narrow corridor. There were a few chairs outside the door, but they were empty. Elena sat down on the edge of one, her knees bouncing up and down with nervous energy. She closed her eyes and tried to visualize the piano keys. She tried to slow her breathing. Asterisk in, out. In, out, asterisk. The door to room 303 opened across the hall. A young man walked out, carrying a violin case. He looked devastated. His face was pale, his eyes red. He didn't look at Elena. He just walked straight past her and toward the stairs, his head hanging low. Elena watched him go, feeling a pit form in her stomach. The judges inside were not messing around. They were tough. 5 minutes later, the door to room 304 opened. A girl walked out, a cellist, holding her instrument like a shield. She was shaking so badly Elena could see it from across the hall. The girl looked at Elena, her eyes wide. "Good luck," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They are intense." Then the girl was gone, and Elena was alone. "Elena?" A deep voice called from inside the room. She stood up. Her legs felt like lead pipes. She forced herself to move, one foot in front of the other, until she stood in the doorway. The room was large and bright, with high ceilings and tall windows letting in the afternoon sun. In the center of the room sat a grand piano, shiny and black, looking like a sleeping beast. Sitting behind a long table were 3 people. In the middle was an older man with wild white hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been combed in a week. He wore a sweater with holes in the elbows. This had to be the director Arthur had warned her about. "Come in," the man said. "Close the door. Don't let the draft in." Elena stepped inside and closed the door gently. The click echoed in the silent room. "So the man said," looking down at a paper on his desk. He didn't look at her. "Elena, Arthur sent you." "Yes, sir," she said. "He tells me you play with soul," the man said, making air quotes with his fingers. He finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, like a hawk's. "Arthur is a wealthy man, and he pays the bills, but he is not a musician. He likes to romanticize things. I am a musician. I deal in reality. Can you play scales? Do you know your theory? Can you read that music in your hand?" Elena looked down at her taped-together sheets. I taught myself mostly, sir. And I had lessons when I was younger. I know the scales." The man grunted. "Self-taught. That usually means bad habits." He looked at the other 2 judges, a man and a woman who were busy taking notes. They didn't look up. "Well, we are busy. You have 5 minutes. Show me what Arthur sees. Don't waste my time." The dismissal in his voice stung. It was the same feeling she had at the restaurant, the feeling of being invisible and unimportant. But then she remembered the night of the performance. She remembered the silence of the room when she finished. She remembered that she had something they didn't have. She had life. She had struggle. Elena walked to the piano. She sat down on the bench. It was firmer than the one at the restaurant and much cleaner. She placed her folder on the music rack. She opened it to her piece of complex sonata she had been practicing obsessively for 3 days. She adjusted the bench. She took a breath. She looked at her hands. They were the same hands that had scrubbed dishes and carried heavy trays. They were scarred and rough, but they were her hands. She didn't play the first note of the sonata instead. She played the same C major chord she had played in the restaurant. It was a risk. It was a huge risk. She heard the man in the chair shift uncomfortably. He sighed loudly, but she didn't stop. She let the chord fade, just like she had before. And then she began to play. It wasn't the sonata from the folder. It was her own improvisation again, but tighter, more focused. She took the raw emotion of that night and channeled it through the technique she had been grinding over for the last 3 days. Her left hand walked up the bass line, steady and strong. Her right hand danced, playing a melody that was sad but beautiful. She thought about the fear she felt standing in the hallway. She thought about the man in the restaurant who had seen her. She poured all of it into the keys. The room was silent. The man with the wild hair stopped writing. He sat up straighter. The woman with the pen stopped taking notes and just listened. They leaned forward. Elena played on. She wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't Elena the waitress. She was Elena the musician. The piano sang under her fingers, the sound filling the high ceiling. She made a mistake, a fumble in the middle passage, and her heart skipped a beat. But she didn't stop. She corrected it, kept the rhythm going, and turned the mistake into a variation. It was fluid. It was alive. She played for 5 minutes. Or maybe it was 10. She lost track of time. She played until she reached the end, the final low notes fading into the silence of the conservatory. She lifted her hands off the keys and let them drop to her lap. She sat there, breathing hard, staring at the wood of the piano. The silence in the room was heavy. It wasn't the cold silence of the beginning. It was a thoughtful silence. Slowly, the man with the wild hair stood up. He walked around the long table. He didn't have a cane like Arthur, but he walked with the same heavy importance. He came right up to the piano and stood over Elena. She turned on the bench to look at him, expecting him to tell her to leave. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her face, streaked with a single tear she hadn't realized had fallen. He looked at her rough hands resting in her lap. He looked at the taped-together music on the rack. "You play wrong," he said gruffly. Elena's stomach dropped. I'm sorry." "No," he snapped. "You play the sonata wrong. Your timing is sloppy. You don't respect the rests. If you were my student, I would fail you on technique alone." Elena felt the tears start to well up again. She nodded, ready to stand up and go. However, the man said, his voice softening just a fraction, "Arthur was right. You have a sound that cannot be taught. You play like you are running out of time. That is something the students here, with their perfect technique, do not have. They have never missed a meal. They have never worked a day in their lives. They have nothing to say you." He pointed a finger at her chest. "You have volumes to say." He walked back to his table and picked up a pen. He scribbled something on a piece of paper with a violent slash of ink. He turned back to her. "We cannot fix your bad habits overnight," he said, "but we can try. Be here tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Don't be late, and bring your own lunch. The cafeteria food is terrible." Lena stared at him. Her brain tried to process the words. "You mean, I'm in?" "You have a scholarship," he said, not looking at her, shuffling papers. "Courtesy of our donor. Now go. I have another violinist waiting who has no soul but perfect pitch. I need a drink." Lena stood up. She didn't bow. She didn't curtsy. She just smiled. It was a genuine, bright smile that lit up her face. She grabbed her folder and her bag. "Thank you," she said clearly. "Thank you." She walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. The hallway didn't feel scary anymore. The portraits on the wall didn't look like judges anymore. They just looked like old paintings. She walked down the stairs, her feet light, floating 2 inches off the ground. She pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the city. The traffic was roaring. People were rushing past. The wind was blowing. The world was chaotic and loud. But Elena stood still on the sidewalk for a moment. She pulled her phone out of her bag. She hesitated, then found the contact Arthur had saved in her phone. She typed a simple text. "I got in." She pressed send. A moment later, the phone buzzed. "Good, now get to work." Elena laughed out loud. A businessman walking past looked at her strangely, but she didn't care. She put the phone away and started walking toward the bus stop. She wasn't going to the restaurant tonight. She was going home to practice. She had a long way to go, and she had a lot to learn. But for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she was going. And the music was leading the way.